Good evening, good vach, and Hag Urim Sameach, or some say Hag Hanukkah Sameach, or some just say Hanukkah Sameach, or some say a Freilich and Hanukkah, but we could just say Happy Hanukkah. It's great to be learning with you on a Saturday night, starting off the week right. Let's light up the darkness, because that's what it's all about during Hanukkah. Lighting up the darkness on this, the third night of Hanukkah. Paul is here from the great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, who got all his writing done for the night. More tomorrow and Monday, but now you can learn. Melissa in Great Neck, Karen in Northern California, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, and Ella saying shalom. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by Michael Apfel, for the zechus, for the merit of those who are still captive in Gaza. Amen. May they be released now, immediately. Now, during the week of miracles, the festival of miracles. Wouldn't it be just great? Please, God, bring all the captives home safely right now. We say amen. And Michael, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Put this one here. Okay. Very interesting daf today. And toward the end of our session tonight, we'll encounter, perhaps some would say, a controversial ruling of the sages that may require some deeper study. We are on Mishna number 2 here in chapter 4. Our daf is page 37. We picked this up just near the top on 37a, the second Mishna of chapter 4, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. With regard to an ox that is forewarned, the muad ox, the ox with a history of goring. With regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, meaning it has already gored other oxen 3 times, but it is not muad, it is not forewarned with regard to other species. Or an ox that is forewarned with regard to people, but is not forewarned with regard to animals. Or one that is forewarned with regard to small specimens of a species, but is not forewarned with regard to large specimens of that species. In all these cases, if the ox gores the type of animal or person with regard to which it is forewarned, with which regard to it is muad, its owner pays the full cost of damage, like any owner of a muad ox. And if it gores an animal or person with regard to which it is not forewarned, he pays half the cost of the damage, meaning it's a tom, it's an innocuous ox with regard, hold on a second. A little too warm in here. Meaning it's an innocuous ox with regard to those types of people or, well, to humans and other animals or types of animals that it has not gored in the past. So this is a brand new concept for us here in our journey through this tractate. We've talked about the tom versus the muad, the innocuous ox versus the forewarned ox so many times. But now we're learning, well, wait a minute, forewarned, we're not going to attach that forewarned label to an ox so quickly, not so readily. we're going to say, at least according to this view, and we're going to see that the sages argue, but according to this view, the majority view, and it's an anonymous Mishna, right? So the dispositive view, that the ox is forewarned with respect to the type of animal or human that it has gored before. So if an ox has attacked humans on 3 occasions, okay, that's a forewarned ox with respect to humans. But if it then attacks another ox for the first time, that's a new thing. That's a new behavior, and we consider it an innocuous ox with respect to that behavior. And the big difference is that its owner is going to be only on the hook for half damages, not full damages. Now, the sages said before Rabbi Yehuda, what would be the law if this ox is forewarned with regard to Shabbos, but is not forewarned with regard to weekdays? And he said to them, for damage it causes on Shabbos, its owner pays the full cost of the damage. And for damage it causes on a weekday, he pays half the cost of the damage. Meaning, this ox has a history of goring people on Shabbos only. He's done that 3 times. So you would think, okay, so, this is a forewarned ox. It has attacked 3 times, but it's only done that on Shabbos. So we say it's a forewarned ox with respect to goring on Shabbos, but not on the weekdays. If it happens to gore on a weekday for the first time, it's never done that before, it's going to be deemed an innocuous ox for that purpose. See how careful the law is to ascribe dangerous intent and a label of being a dangerous animal, to an ox. How much more so, Kal v'chomer, should we be careful about judging others and labeling them, with some kind of fierce negative, summary of their person and personality, right? When the law is so careful even about naming a goring ox, when it only has a history of goring in a particular way. I mean, this is a very surprising ruling. When is it rendered innocuous again after being forewarned with respect to Shabbos? It reverts to its innocuous status when its behavior reverts to normal. In other words, when it refrains from goring on 3 Shabboses in succession. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. It was stated that Rav Zevid said, and this is going to be the minority view, the version of the Mishnah, of this Mishnah, that we learned states, with regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, but is not forewarned with regard to other species, referring to an ox that is proven to be innocuous with regard to other species. If it gores another species, its owner pays only half the cost of the damage. Rav Papa said the version of the Mishnah that we learned states an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species. Accordingly, the Mishnah is teaching that the fact that it is forewarned with regard to goring one species does not render it forewarned with regard to other species until it is proven otherwise. Right? So in other words, what Rav Zevid is saying is that if it's a habitual gorer, it's going to be a habitual gorer, period. But it can be rendered innocuous with respect to other species if it has that opportunity to gore, let's say a donkey 3 times and it doesn't do it. So we'll say, well, it's a habitual gorer, it is a muad, but with respect to donkeys, it's innocuous. That's Rav Zevid's point of view, right? That once it's a muad, once it's a forewarned ox, it's a forewarned ox generally, but it can be rendered innocuous with respect to, these other limited cases, like with respect to donkeys or even with respect to other species that are not oxen. Rav Papa says, no, the default position is if it's a muad, right? But you're saying, what did it gore 3 times? Well, it gored oxen 3 times. Okay, so it's a muad with respect to oxen. But we don't extend that label to other species of animals that it might gore until proven otherwise. Rather, we say that it is only a muad, only a forewarned ox with respect to oxen, and it will become muad with respect to other species when it proves itself to be that. right? So, and that's the majority view. We follow Rav Papa. So according to Rav Papa, we don't label an ox a muad with respect to any particular type of victim, right? Whether it's other oxen or other species or humans, until it proves that it's a muad with respect to that group. Now the Gemara explains. Rav Zevid said that the version of the Mishnah that we learned states hold on a second, it's really warm in here. Stupid me, I forgot to turn off the heater in here yesterday when I left the office, and so it was just on all night. Now the light's on and I'm feeling the effects. Okay, here we go. Hopefully I won't need to turn on the AC. Now, the Gemara explains, Rav Zevid said that the version of the Mishnah that we learned states with regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, but is not forewarned with regard to other species, indicating that it is referring specifically to an ox that is proven to be innocuous with regard to other species. This implies that in an ordinary case, where there is no such proof, the ox is considered forewarned with regard to all species, right? Rav Zevid would extend that label. It's just a muad ox, a forewarned ox, period. And until we prove that it is innocuous with respect to people or other species or something like that, it's forewarned, period. Rav Papa, by contrast, said that the version of the Mishnah that we learned states an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species, meaning that in an ordinary case, the ox is not considered forewarned with regard to other species. Rav Zevid inferred his opinion from the latter clause of our Mishnah, whereas Rav Papa inferred his opinion from the former clause. Rav Zevid inferred his opinion from the latter clause as it teaches an ox that is forewarned with regard to small specimens of a species, but is not forewarned with regard to large specimens of that species. So granted, if you say, in other words, that the ox only attacks the smaller specimens, so we're not going to assume that it's forewarned with respect to larger specimens. Now, with regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, it gores other oxen, but is not forewarned with regard to other species, indicating that in an ordinary case, the ox is considered forewarned with regard to all animals. So this clause of the Mishnah teaches us that even from being forewarned with regard to small specimens of a species, in an ordinary case, the ox is thereby considered forewarned with regard to large specimens of that species, which is a more far-reaching statement, as an ox is less likely to gore large animals. But if you say that the Mishnah teaches an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species, meaning that in an ordinary case where there is no proof to the contrary, the ox is not considered forewarned with regard to other species, which is Rav Papa's position, there is a difficulty with the latter clause of the Mishnah, and the Gemara explains. Now that it can be said that from being forewarned with regard to small oxen, in an ordinary case, the ox is not thereby considered forewarned with regard to small animals in general, need it be said that from being forewarned with regard to small specimens of a species, it is not thereby considered forewarned with regard to large specimens of that species? It must be that the Mishnah reads, but is not forewarned, indicating that only when the ox is proven to be innocuous with regard to other species, and then it gores in other species, is its owner liable to pay only half the cost of the damage. Otherwise, he must pay the full cost of the damage. Right? The Gemara is explaining how Rav Zevid arrived at the conclusion that once an ox is rendered forewarned, it's forewarned against all things that it might gore in the future, whether oxen, whether small oxen, big oxen, other species of animals, or humans. It was a forewarned ox, owner pays full damages. Only exception would be if it has the opportunity to gore, let's say, a donkey 3 times, and it doesn't gore it, so then we say it's innocuous with regard to donkeys. That's Rav Zevid's point of view, and that's how he got there. And Rav Papa could have said to you in response that even if the Mishnah reads an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species, the latter clause is necessary, as otherwise it might enter your mind to say that since it breached the norm by attacking one of that species, it is considered to have breached the norm entirely with regard to that species, and there is no difference with regard to large members of the species, and there is no difference with regard to small members of it, as the ox is now likely to gore any of them. Therefore, this clause of the Mishnah teaches us that it is not considered forewarned with regard to large animals of that species. And as stated previously, Rav Papa inferred his opinion that once forewarned, we only consider it forewarned with respect to the group that it's forewarned about. Rav Papa inferred his opinion from the former clause of our Mishnah. As the Mishnah teaches, an ox that is forewarned with regard to people is not forewarned with regard to animals. Now, granted, if you say that we learn that the Mishnah states an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species, which would indicate that in an ordinary case where there is no proof to the contrary, it is not considered forewarned with regard to other species, then the Mishnah in the next clause teaches us this, that even from being forewarned with regard to people, in an ordinary case, the ox is not considered forewarned with regard to animals. The ox is considered innocuous with regard to animals, although it is far more common for an ox to gore other animals than a person. But if you say that the Mishnah teaches in the first clause with regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, but is not forewarned with regard to other species, indicating that in an ordinary case it is considered forewarned with regard to other species, like Rav Zevid would hold, then there would be a difficulty with the following clause of the Mishnah. Now that it can be said that even from being forewarned with regard to one species of animal, in an ordinary case it is thereby considered forewarned with regard to other species of animals, need it be said that from its being forewarned with regard to people, it is also considered forewarned with regard to animals? Therefore, we know, according to Rav Papa, that forewarned means forewarned only with respect to the group that it's forewarned about, that it attacked before, not other groups that it has not attacked. And Rav Zevid could have responded, well, the former clause in the Mishnah relates to the ox reverting to its innocuous status, i.e., a case where the ox was forewarned with regard to man and forewarned with regard to animals, and it reverted to its innocuous status with regard to animals, as it stood in close proximity to an animal 3 times and it did not gore. So it went back out of forewarned status and it returned to innocuous status. So lest you say that since it did not demonstratively revert to its innocuous behavior toward people, as it did not refrain from goring people, its reversal with regard to animals is not considered a reversal. The Mishnah teaches us that its reversal is considered, that its reversal with regard to animals is nevertheless considered a reversal, and it no longer has the status of a forewarned ox with regard to goring animals. Right? This is Rav Zevid trying to prove that his view of the Mishnah, that forewarned means forewarned with respect to all animals, and to become innocuous again, it just needs to prove that it is innocuous with respect to some particular group. That's how he would prove that, but he lost this debate. Now, the Gemara raises an objection to Rav Zevid's opinion from a Baraisa. Sumakos says, an ox that is forewarned with regard to people is considered forewarned with regard to animals due to a kal vachomer inference. If it is forewarned with regard to people, is it not clear all the more so that it is forewarned with regard to animals? And the Gemara elaborates, how is this a proof of Rav Papa's point of view? How is this an argument against Rav Zevid if he's saying forewarned with respect to people is considered forewarned with respect to animals? Well, by inference, the first Tana, i.e. the Tana of our Mishnah, is saying that the ox is not considered forewarned with respect to animals, and this is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa. Now, the Gemara answers, Rav Zevid could have responded to you that Sumakos' statement can be interpreted as relating to the ox reverting to its innocuous status. And this is what he is saying to the first Tana. Contrary to what you are saying, that the ox's reversal with regard to animals is considered a reversal, although it has not reversed its behavior toward people, I, Rav Zevid, maintain that its reversal with regard to animals is not considered a reversal, due to the kal vachomer inference from the law of an animal forewarned with regard to people. If the ox had not reverted to its innocuous behavior toward people, is it not clear all the more so that it has not truly reverted to its innocuous behavior toward animals? Rav Ashi said, come and hear a proof for Rav Zevid. The sages said before Rabbi Yehuda, what would be the law if this ox is forewarned with regard to Shabbos, but is not forewarned with regard to weekdays? And he said to them, for damage it causes on Shabbos, its owner pays the full cost, meaning it's forewarned with respect to doing damage on Shabbos. And for damage it causes on weekdays, he pays half the cost of the damage, meaning it's considered an innocuous ox, a tom, with respect to damage it does on weekdays. Granted, if you say that the Mishnah teaches, but was not forewarned with regard to weekdays, they were asking him about the law in that case, and likewise he was answering them with a ruling. But if you say that the Mishnah teaches this ox that is forewarned with regard to Shabbos is not forewarned with regard to weekdays, the Mishnah would be understood as saying that an ox that is forewarned with regard to Shabbos is not considered forewarned with regard to weekdays. Yes? Is it possible that the sages were teaching him this law? And furthermore, what was he responding to them? They had already stated themselves that the ox is not considered forewarned with regard to weekdays, right? In other words, if the sages were saying this before Rabbi Yehuda, it wasn't just to restate the law that's already in the Mishnah. What is it that they were really debating? So Rav Yanai said, Rav Zevid's opinion. Rav Zevid, who says forewarned for one category means forewarned for all. Rav Zevid's opinion can be inferred from the former clause of the Mishnah as well, as it teaches if the ox gores an animal or a person with regard to which it is forewarned, its owner pays the full cost of the damage. And if it gores an animal or person with regard to which it is not forewarned, he pays half the cost of the damage. Now that should not be a proof at all, because all we're learning there is, well, if he's, considered forewarned for goring other oxen, owner pays full. If he's considered innocuous for goring donkeys, owner pays half when he gores a donkey. Okay, how did he get that way? Was it that he was only forewarned with respect to oxen and he gored a donkey? Or was it that he was forewarned for all animals and then he regained his innocuous status with respect to donkeys, right? So we could get there either by Rav Papa or Rav Zevid. But Rav Yanai is saying, granted, if you say that the Mishnah teaches in the first clause with regard to an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species, but is not forewarned with regard to other species, this clause is explaining the law in that case, i.e., if the ox is forewarned only with regard to its species, its owner is liable to pay the full cost of the damage only if it gores another ox. But if you say that the Mishnah teaches an ox that is forewarned with regard to its own species is not forewarned with regard to other species in the ordinary course of things, and the law was already determined at the beginning of the Mishnah, namely that the ox is not considered forewarned with regard to other species, then what need is there for the Mishnah to further state if the ox gores an animal or person with regard to which it is forewarned, the owner pays the full cost of the damage. And if it gores an animal or person with regard to which it is not forewarned, he pays half the cost of the damage. Has the Mishnah not taught us until now that for an innocuous ox, its owner pays half the cost of the damage, and for a forewarned ox, he pays the full cost of the damage? Therefore, since it teaches that again later in the Mishnah, it must be because it's talking about an ox that regained its innocuous status after it was considered forewarned for all species and it regained innocuous for some. Therefore, this would seem to be a proof for Rav Zevid. The Gemara comments, and even if you say that Rav Papa's opinion, which says that an ox is forewarned with regard to its own species only, and it is not considered forewarned with regard to other species, even if we accept this view, nevertheless, if an ox gored an ox, a donkey, and a camel, it is thereby forewarned with regard to all of them. The ox is considered forewarned with regard to all three species, regardless of the fact that it did not gore any individual species 3 times, and that is the law. The sages taught if an ox saw an ox and gored it, and subsequently saw another ox but did not gore it, again saw an ox and gored it, and then saw another ox but did not gore it, and a third time saw an ox and gored it, and then saw another ox and did not gore it. In other words, this is an ox that only gores every other ox. Every other is misleading. That gores only, in other words, he's facing 6 oxen, and he's going to gore the first but not the second, the third but not the fourth, and the fifth but not the sixth, right? He's only alternating who he's goring. So in that situation, guess what? In this case, this ox is rendered forewarned with regard to alternate oxen. The ox is considered forewarned with regard to goring every other ox that it sees, and is considered innocuous with regard to the oxen in between. If it then gores 2 oxen in a row, the owner of the ox is liable for only half the cost of the damage for the second ox. If you can establish a pattern that it only gores in this cert according to a pattern, so then it's considered muad, forewarned, only in that pattern. And if it breaks the pattern, it's an innocuous ox for the damage that it does there. Surprising, but that is the law. If an ox sees another ox and gores it, and the next day it sees an ox but does not gore, and the day after that it sees an ox and gores it, but on the 4th day it sees one and does not gore, and on the 5th day it gores an ox, while on the 6th it sees an ox and does not gore it, in this case the ox is considered forewarned with regard to oxen on alternate days. Crazy, but that's the way it is. The sages taught if an ox saw an ox and gored it, and then saw a donkey but did not gore it, saw a horse and gored it, then saw a camel and did not gore it, and saw a mule and gored it, and then saw a wild donkey and did not gore it. In this case, it is rendered forewarned with regard to alternate animals of all species. It has to be a pretty clear pattern to consider it forewarned only within that pattern. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages, and now we're on page 37b. If an ox gored an ox, another ox, and a third ox, and then a donkey and a camel, with regard to what is it considered forewarned? You might think, well, definitely muad with respect to oxen. It gored 3 oxen. And then a camel and a donkey, so must be forewarned with respect to other species or all animals. What do we think? The Gemara presents the possibilities. With regard to this last ox that was gored together with the donkey and the camel, do we place it together with the previously gored oxen? And accordingly, the belligerent ox was still rendered forewarned only with regard to oxen. Whereas with regard to other species, it has only gored twice, not 3 times, and therefore we say it's still innocuous with regard to other species. Or perhaps we place this last ox together with the donkey and the camel, and then we render it forewarned with regard to all species, or at least all species that it has gored, oxen, camels, and donkeys. So the Gemara adds a similar dilemma. So that's the question. We don't have an answer yet. Then the Gemara adds a similar dilemma. If an ox gored a donkey and a camel, and then an ox, and another ox, what is the law? Just the reverse order of what we said before. So again, what are the possibilities? With regard to this first ox that it gored, do we place it together with the camel and the donkey that came before? And accordingly, the belligerent ox is rendered forewarned with regard to all species. Or perhaps we place the ox as the third animal that was gored together with the 4th and 5th, which are all oxen. And so we say it is rendered forewarned only with respect to oxen. Similarly, if it gored on a Shabbos, and on a Shabbos, and on a Shabbos, meaning 3 consecutive Shabboses, and then on Sunday and on Monday, what is the law? With regard to this last Shabbos, do we place it together with the previous Shabbos, and the ox was still rendered forewarned only with regard to Shabbos, whereas with regard to weekdays it was not rendered forewarned? Or perhaps we place it together with the goring on Sunday and Monday, and it was thereby rendered forewarned with regard to all days of the week. And if an ox gored on Thursday, Friday, and Shabbos, and then the next Shabbos, and then the next Shabbos after that, then what is the law? With regard to this first Shabbos, do we place it together with Thursday and Friday and say it's forewarned with all days of the week? Or do we group that Shabbos together with the later Shabboses and say the ox is rendered forewarned only with regard to Shabbos, And the answer is teku. The dilemma shall stand unresolved. Now, with regard to this idea that the ox only gores on Shabbos and how crazy that sounds, is this some kind of odd hypothetical that we're just doing to test our understanding of the law, but it's totally divorced from reality? No. Let me read you this note, which is about the donkey goring on Shabbos, which is fascinating. Why would an ox be more likely to gore specifically on Shabbos? In the Jerusalem Talmud, it is explained that as people wear different clothes on Shabbos, the ox does not recognize them. And since they appear to be strangers, it might be more likely to gore them. Accordingly, this status applies only with regard to goring people. The idea that it's a muad of Shabbos is only with regard to goring people because they change their appearance on Shabbos, whereas other animals don't. Rashi explains that since an ox is not utilized for labor on Shabbos, it feels free and unrestrained, which can cause it to gore more than on days when it is utilized for labor. Okay. Let's continue. If an ox gored on the 15th day of this month, and subsequently gored on the 16th day of the month, and after that on the 17th day of the month, and after that, the law is subject to dispute between Rav and Shmuel with regard to a parallel discussion concerning a woman whose menstrual cycle begins on a different day each month. As it was stated, if a woman saw menstrual blood on the 15th day of this month, and on the 16th day of the month after that, and on the 17th day of the month after that, Rav says since she has thereby established her menstrual cycle, i.e. a month and 1 day. And Shmuel says her menstrual cycle is not established until she skips a day 3 times. According to Shmuel, the cycle is established in this case not by the date per se, but rather by the pattern of 1 additional day every month. Only when this occurs for 3 consecutive months, i.e. when she menstruates in the 4th month, is the pattern established. Rava said, if an ox heard the sound of a shofar and gored, and again heard the sound of a shofar and gored, and a 3rd time heard the sound of a shofar and gored, it is rendered forewarned with regard to the sound of a shofar. So that's an ox that if it's gonna be around a shofar being blown, you better have a lot of safeguarding because it's considered muad when a shofar is blown. Now the Gemara asks, well, isn't this obvious? And the Gemara answers, lest you say that this first shofar merely startled the ox, prompting it to gore, and that consequently should not count for the purpose of rendering the ox forewarned. Rava teaches us that since the ox repeatedly gored upon hearing the sound of a shofar, the sound is considered a consistent impetus for its goring. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Here comes Mishnah number 3. And this one is, like I said, maybe a little bit controversial. And I was kind of, let's just get into it. Mishnah number 3, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, chapter 4. With regard to an ox of a Jew that gored a consecrated ox, and conversely, a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox, i.e. an ox owned by a Jew, the owner of the ox is exempt from paying compensation, as it is stated, and if one man's ox hurts the ox of another, Exodus 21:35, and it is derived from the phrase, the ox of another, that one is liable only if it is a non-sacred ox, but not if it is a consecrated ox, which belongs to the temple treasury, regardless of whether the latter was the ox that gored or the ox that was gored. Okay? With regard to an ox of a Jew that gored the ox of a Canaanite, the owner of the belligerent ox is exempt from liability. With regard to an ox of a Canaanite that gored the ox of a Jew, regardless of whether the goring ox was innocuous or forewarned, the owner of the ox pays the full cost of the damage. That's our Mishnah. Now, this is one of those passages that certain, anti-Semites will say that the Talmud says Jews can do anything they want to non-Jews, and according to their law, they get away with it, and therefore this is an evil religion and evil people, etc. Naturally, there's more context to this law, and we're going to get into it not so much tonight, because right now we're going to focus on when a consecrated ox gores or is gored by the ox of a Jew, and tomorrow we'll get a little bit more into when there's a goring that transpires between the ox of a Jew and the ox of a Canaanite. But suffice to say that there is a lot of nuance to this law, and we'll get deeper into it tomorrow. So let's just continue now with the Gemara on Mishnah number 3. The Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to a non-sacred ox that gored a consecrated ox, or a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox. The owner of the ox is exempt from liability, as it is stated, the ox of another, indicating, but not a consecrated ox. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says, with regard to a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox, the temple treasury is exempt from liability. But with regard to a non-sacred ox that gored a consecrated ox, whether it was innocuous or forewarned, the owner pays the full cost of the damage. As always, right, the temple treasury wins, lest we take any kind of benefit from an interaction with the property of the Holy Temple. You don't want to win that interaction. You want to come out on the bottom, right? You want that, always the treasury, meaning the Holy Temple should always come out on top, lest you somehow commit the transgression of Me'ilah, of making personal use of consecrated property. The sages said, what does Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya hold? Why does he distinguish between a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox and a non-sacred ox that gored a consecrated ox? If the phrase in the Torah of another, an ox of another, right? If my ox gores the ox of another, sounds like an ox that I own gores an ox owned by another person, and specifically another Jew. Which would exclude a consecrated ox, which is not owned by another Jew. It's owned by the temple treasury. So why doesn't Shimon ben Menasya agree with that? If the phrase of another is meant in a precise manner, then even with regard to a non-sacred ox that gored a consecrated ox, the owner, the belligerent ox, should be exempt from liability, as the victim is not the ox of another Jew, but belongs to the temple treasury. And if the phrase of another is not meant in a precise manner, but rather includes all oxen, well then a consecrated ox that gored a non-sacred ox should render the temple treasury liable as well. And if you would say that actually Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya holds that of another is meant in a precise manner, and accordingly, if a consecrated ox gores a non-sacred ox, the temple treasury is exempt from liability, but nevertheless, when a non-sacred ox gores a consecrated ox, this is the reason that its owner is liable, namely because Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya infers it as a kal v'chomer inference from the case of a non-sacred ox like this. If in the case of a non-sacred ox that gores another non-sacred ox, the owner, the belligerent ox, is liable, is it not clear all the more so that when it gores a consecrated ox, the owner of the ox is liable? If this is Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya's reasoning, then his ruling that the owner of the ox pays the temple treasury the full cost of the damage, whether his ox was innocuous or forewarned, is problematic, as it is sufficient for the conclusion that emerges from a kal v'chomer inference to be like its source. In other words, a law derived by means of a kal v'chomer inference cannot be more stringent than the law of the source from which it is derived. Therefore, just as there in the case when an individual's innocuous non-sacred ox gores another non-sacred ox, the owner pays only half the cost of the damage. Here too, if an innocuous non-sacred ox gores a consecrated ox, its owner should be liable to pay only half the cost of the damage to the temple treasury. So rather, Reish Lakish said that Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya's reasoning is not like that. It's like this. In principle, all cases of damage were included among those in which the owner pays the full cost of the damage. The law that in a case of an innocuous ox, the owner pays only half the cost of the damage is an exception to the rule, And when the verse specified the term of another with regard to an innocuous ox, it intended that it is specifically when one's innocuous ox gores the ox of another person or of a fellow Jew that the owner pays only half the cost of the damage. And by inference, if it gores a consecrated ox, whether the belligerent ox is innocuous or forewarned, its owner pays the full cost of the damage because the exception doesn't apply since it's being used in a case where the ox that was gored was not owned by another. Cramp. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Because if so... if one whose ox gores a consecrated ox is exempt from liability, let the verse write the phrase of another with regard to the case of the forewarned ox. One could then infer that the owner is exempt from liability in the case of an innocuous ox as well, as the liability with regard to an innocuous ox is less severe than with regard to a forewarned ox. The stating of this exemption specifically in the context of the innocuous ox indicates that the exemption is only concerning the leniency stated in the verse, that if the gored ox belongs to another person, the owner of the belligerent ox is liable to pay only half the cost of the damage. That's according to Reish Lakish's explanation of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, but the law is that, per the Mishna, if there's a consecrated ox involved, whether it gores or is gored, no liability because it's not owned by your fellow. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. Let's take a few comments or questions. Tom, can we learn out more generally applicable principles from this? Say, if a person commits a crime such as pickpocketing or shoplifting or cheating at cards regularly, can such a person be considered, as it were, forewarned with respect to all crime or only with respect to what he's done before? Right? So it sounds like, since we follow Rav Papa, it's very interesting, right? Like we do learn elsewhere in the Talmud that a professional gambler, I'm pretty sure, is disqualified from being a witness, right? Because since he makes his living through stealing, right? And that's what the sages deem a professional gambler, that he's one who's so crafty at gambling that he goes into gambling. Even though he's not technically stealing, he's so much better at it than other people. It's like the 3-card Monte game. He's so much better at it that he, routinely fleeces the lambs. And so therefore, he's disqualified from being a witness in a court case because he's not deemed trustworthy to tell the truth, right? Now, that would seem to violate this principle. If we say, okay, well, he's guilty of being a gambler, maybe he's guilty of being a pickpocket in your example, but why should that disqualify him from being a witness? Or why should we assume that, he's not somebody that you can do business with, or he's not someone that you can hire, to be a watchman for your flock? He's never stolen sheep before. He's never stolen before. Let's say he's not a pickpocket, but, some other kind of a crime. Let's say that he's a fighter and he's been convicted of assault a few times. He's punched people because he was angry. Does that mean he's disqualified from being a shepherd for your flock? It would seem not, if we follow this principle. Now, I don't know if we want to extend this principle to these other kinds of behaviors, but I think you've asked a really interesting question. Joseph, it's a kal v'chomer with 2 categories of human and animals. Is that valid? So I'm trying to unpack what you're saying. According to Rav Papa, I think what you're saying is if it gored an ox, a donkey, and a human, are we going to say therefore it's considered forewarned, period? Even according to Rav Papa. And it sounds to me like yes, because certainly if it gored an ox, a camel, and a donkey, we're saying forewarned with respect to all species. Is it forewarned with respect to humans? Maybe not. But if we now say a human, an ox, and a donkey, sounds like forewarned, period. I think that's what you're asking. I think I would agree with you, but I'm not sure. So that's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, when we'll get into some very delicate water as we examine this law that the ox of a Jew, which gores the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. Why would the law be that way? And what, what kind of legal system and legal situation would that create? And very interesting question. If that was the law in Talmudic times when the Jews were being persecuted heavily by idolatrous empires, is that still the law today? Does it apply only to the ox goring, or is this some kind of, principle that we extend into other areas of the law? Tune in tomorrow. Have a great night.